Welcome to the fourth video in my series on how to write a gamebook. Back in part 3, we were drawing a number of blue circles which represented various segments of your plot arc. In this video, we're going to drill down into one of those blue segments and I'll show you what's inside and how you write it. All you need for this stage is a pencil and some paper. I tend to draw these out on A4 sheets or letter-sized pieces of paper, and I'm doing it by hand. In this modern age, of course, there are many tools that allow you to draw on screen. Perhaps you use Visio or Paint or something like that. But I tend to find these get in the way. You end up fiddling with the system you're using rather than spending time on actually drawing out the entries that are going to appear in your segment. My experience has shown that those tools end up being a distraction. You spend too much time fiddling, rearranging, that sort of thing. You may remember from the previous video that I like to have around 50 entries in my gamebook for each of those blue circles on the plot arc. So on this one sheet of paper, we're going to have 50 entries within the gamebook. Each entry is about a paragraph of text. It might include a combat, it might just be a piece of travelogue, or it could be some character explanation. Basically, what we need to note down on this sheet of paper is what is in that paragraph. We're not writing the paragraph, we're just writing perhaps as much as 5 or 6 words indicating what will be contained within that paragraph. I'll show you an example in a few minutes. The purpose of this blank sheet is to note these down and then perhaps join them up using lines. We're not writing a list, we're doing a brainstorming exercise, if you will. We're going to note down our 50 possible entries and join them up with pencil lines. And that'll indicate the flow, or rather the path that the person follows through these entries, through this part of the book. As you're coming up with the ideas, you'll note them down on this sheet of paper, and you may have an inclination to edit at this point. It's good, it's easier to fix things now, but make sure you are editing. If you're rubbing something out, make sure you're doing an actual edit. Don't spend time, do not waste your time tidying this sheet of paper. It's a brainstorm. It's literally a mess of ideas thrown down onto a sheet of paper. It doesn't matter if it looks messy. It doesn't matter if it's the worst piece of stuff you've ever produced. It doesn't matter. It's just ideas. You want to get them down on a piece of paper. It's the final story that matters, not this stage. We have a couple of goals that we want to achieve with this sheet of paper. Firstly, 50 ideas, 50 paragraph ideas written down on this sheet of paper. Also, we want to try and make sure that we keep our story interesting. That means that we want to try and limit the number of sequential paragraphs or entries to 5. What this means is that at least every 5th entry, we give the reader a choice, a decision to make. Which way are they going to go? So our diagram will branch at this point. Every 5th entry or so will have another branch, and sometimes those branches will converge again so that we don't end up with too many branches. As I said, a maximum of 5 sequential entries, otherwise it just turns into a straightforward book. If you have experience in reading game books, you know that normally the various entries are numbered, 1 through 400. At this stage, don't worry about doing that. Don't number these entries. At a later stage, we'll be shuffling these entries so that they don't appear next to each other in the gamebook. So any numbers you applied here won't make any sense when you finally come to process the book at the end. So let's take a look at one of these sheets that I'm telling you to create. Now in this sample, you see I've broken every one of my rules, but let me explain what's going on. If you look closely at this document, you'll see the paragraphs have been numbered. That's simply me, however, counting how many are on this page. The important thing here is to note what I've actually written for each paragraph and how I've joined them up with arrows. You can see I haven't written a lot of detail in here. Each entry just simply says 2-3 words indicating what's going to be written in that paragraph. On their own, each of these entries written here doesn't make a lot of sense. But within the context of the book, and if you follow the various lines of the arrows, you can perhaps get a better idea of what I was aiming at. And that process of looking and checking the nearby entries is something you'll do when you're actually writing the text to go along with each of these paragraphs. So each of these phrases that you can see written here on this diagram represents an entry in my gamebook, that is, a paragraph or 2 paragraphs of text, and then it will leap onto the next entry. You can see how I've branched my story in a number of places, how it's reconverged in other places, and you can see some smudges where I've rubbed things out and changed my mind. I've redirected some of the entries from one place to another, and this is the easiest place to do your story edits. If you left this kind of editing until you've written these paragraphs, everything becomes more difficult and time-consuming. At this stage, of course, I can just roll this piece of paper up and throw it in the bin, or I can redraw it. The one thing I don't do at this point is tidying. This is a mess, and it will stay a mess until the book is done. It's just for recording my ideas and my plan for writing this book. So let's move on. Once you've drawn all your diagrams, it's a good idea to put them aside for a little while. Come back to it and look at it with fresh eyes the next day or the next week. And you have to ask yourself a series of questions. You need to look at each of your sheets of paper and then apply these questions to it. Look at the diagram and then look through your ideas, what you've written down there. Envision the story that you're creating and ask yourself, does it make sense? It's a very simple question to ask, but perhaps you've put something in there in the flow of the story that doesn't actually make sense at that point. If you do find something like that, cross it out, replace it with something else. Next, you need to ask yourself, have you got any loops? Follow the lines of the arrows in your story and make sure that you haven't got yourself into an inadvertent loop. There's nothing your reader's going to hate more than reading the same 5 paragraphs over and over, because there's no way to get out of that loop. This is your chance to make sure you haven't written any of those. The next step is to make sure you haven't duplicated anything between your segments. For this, you need to compare this diagram with all the other diagrams. You're basically looking for any duplication of plot. Something you don't want to have is they go through one segment of your book and they fight a walrus on the beach. You don't want to have them fighting a walrus on a beach in the next segment and the next segment after that. You want to have something different and interesting, so look for any duplication. Have you reused the same idea over and over? If you have, correct it now. The next question is, do you have a lack of choice? That is to say, do you have enough branches in this segment? Or have you just written a part of a normal fiction book? You need branches, you need choices in order to turn this into a game book. So make sure you've got enough branches and do a count, basically, to find out how often you're presenting those branches. The next check is you need to look for slow bits. Now, this means you have to reinterrogate what you've written down. You have to ensure that there's some action or activity in each of those entries. If an entry is just walking from one room to another, it's not interesting. It's not going to keep your reader interested in the story. This is something you'd have to do if you were writing a novel. You don't want slow bits. And let me reiterate, this is the easiest time to fix mistakes. You haven't written pages and pages of text that you need to throw away or re-edit. It's at this point, when you're still planning, that it's easiest to fix your mistakes.